Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, our lecturer in philosophy, and our current lecturer in epistemology, which we're covering, which we're going through right now. So I want to invite our listeners to go over to Catholic Studies Academy, check out all of our philosophy and theology classes that we have over there. And if you're a new listener, just in case, what we've done is we've taken kind of the subjects and the topics and the courses that you'd find like at a four-year university if you were majoring in philosophy and theology. And what we've done is we've condensed the classes to cover the same subjects and topic. Yeah, not in as much detail, but we provide further reading, and our professors are available to you to guide you through any further discovery and study of all these topics. And so we at Catholic Studies Academy, we really want to bridge that gap between the solid catechesis you may find at a parish and going off and getting a four-year degree or a master's degree or something like that. We want to fill that gap both intellectually and financially. So check us out over there. Today our topic is going to be we're going to look at one of the authors. It's going to be Roger Scruton. And we're going to look particularly at one of his books, The Idea of Pessimism. And but before we do that, Roger Scruton, he passed away recently, and he was an author of over 50 books. He was a political philosopher, English political philosopher. He wrote extensively in aesthetics, political philosophy, traditional conservative views. He also wrote novels, and he even wrote 2 operas, which I just found out, which was quite astounding. Quite a list of accomplishments for Sir Roger Scruton. But I do want to point one of our listeners, if you're taking, Dr. Smith's metaphysics class, Roger Scruton has a book called "I Drink, Therefore I Am," and in that book, he pairs certain wines with philosophers, and I'm sure this is going to be a great point of departure with Dr. Smith. But when he's talking about Aristotle, Dr. Smith, I don't know if you know this, when he's talking about Aristotle, he says, if you're to read one of the driest books ever written, you need plenty of water. so he recommends that you read or that you drink water while reading the metaphysics. It's not as though Nicomachean ethics. So.
Yeah, that may be true. That may be true. I will concede that Aristotle's metaphysics is pretty dry, but I'll counter with this point. I'm stealing this phrase from someone else. That although Aristotle's metaphysics may be dry, it's dry in the same way that gold dust is dry. Right? Dry as gold dust. Yeah, so there you
go. That's good. All right, well, let's hop into it. So Sir Roger Scruton, he wrote a book called The Idea of Pessimism. And Dr. Smith, you've read some of Sir Roger Scruton's material, his books. And so why don't you get us started and get us kind of introduced into this, which by the way, I just love the title of that. It just sounds, it makes me feel better about myself.
The full title here is The Uses of Pessimism and the Danger of False Hope. Here, I'll hold this up and take a minute for the camera to adjust, but you'll see that there's an ice cream cone that someone has dropped and it's melting on the pavement.
Poor child.
Child. So at this point, I say, oh, that's so depressing. But part of the point is, just some of life is that way, and while one, he qualifies a lot, in this work. One wouldn't want to only think about dropped ice cream cones, right?
Yeah.
Or the downside, right? That's just a symbol of the downside. Nevertheless, it's unreasonable, really, to only think of the upside, right?
Yeah.
And while there is probably a certain psychological advantage to being, up to a point, a certain psychological advantage to thinking positively and not dwelling on the downside, at the same time, ignoring the downside is probably just not practical or rational or logical, right?
Yeah.
And
right?
Yeah, right. And in the long run, actually, will probably damage our effectiveness, right? Even at a practical level. Before we get into all this, just a couple things here. First, I'm not an expert in Roger Scruton. If you're working in political philosophy, though, at all, which I am, you're at least going to be familiar with his thought. Generally, he's regarded as a conservative, and he's considered a conservative of the Edmund Burke kind of school of conservatism. So if you're there's different sort of strains of conservatism, especially in American intellectual life, or we'll call it the English-speaking world, maybe. Some of it comes out of Leo Strauss. Some of it comes out of a kind of more libertarian strain, like a classical liberalism kind of strain. But then there's also the Edmund Burke kind of strain, which is very much a kind of an English version of conservatism. You can find other versions, similar things on the continent, but he's very much on that side of things, where he speaks very explicitly about the importance of tradition and community as really sort of pillars of political life. American conservatives do sometimes appeal to tradition. They don't use that word tradition, but appeal to older ways. But less so towards community, you might say. But this book, so I was interested in this book, one, because I'm interested in the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, who is a metaphysical pessimist. And so he's just Schopenhauer is just a fascinating and interesting writer and thinker. He's deeply wrong, I think, ultimately, but he is fascinating. And Scruton has a lot of interest in him, but also because, from what I had read, this was an important book, an important theme in political philosophy. So there are two kind of controlling ideas that are at work in this book. So this isn't laid out like a systematic treatise. It's more, here are some main ideas, and then here's some applications of those ideas. So I'll try to lay out a couple of main ideas, and then we can jump in to thinking about those. So the first, I'll just go with three of them, right?
Sure.
And the first one I've already discussed, we've already just mentioned here, and that is paying attention to the downside, right? That is that life does include suffering, and life does include failure, and life does include complications. And in fact, one of the things he really wants to focus on is the idea that human beings and societies are complicated. And if you try to oversimplify that situation, what you end up doing is falsifying it. So one of the things he thinks you just really have to kind of accept, right, in order to think with maturity, is that people are kind of complicated and flawed. And I mean, does that make sense, right?
Yeah. It reminds me of in one of Dr. Kelly's classes where he was just talking about, like, today the idea that is common, and for good reason. The idea that people are just generally good all of the time. Like that's, and not that Dr. Kelly was saying that's wrong and a stupid idea or something like that, but he was saying that is a fairly new idea in the history of ideas. That wasn't always the case. That people thought everybody else was generally good, and people were generally good or something. That wasn't always the case. And so many of the things that we kind of just take for granted in our own kind of worldview or outlook with regards to human nature are fairly new ideas. And they may be not necessarily flawed, but kind of in this case, they may be painted with a tint of rose. You know what I mean?
Right. So this is the thing. This should just be verified by our experience as even at an individual level, even just of ourselves, right? I mean, we're honest, right? I mean, we should just kind of like, do I know human beings are flawed? I just need to look in the mirror. And you'll kind of figure that out. If you don't have that conclusion, then you're probably deluded. And there's a sort of deeper problem there. So one is just straight up recognizing, right, the imperfections and the complexities of human beings. Another one, which I think is kind of interesting, and I agree with him on, for the most part, I have a little hesitation with, but is the tendency we have to move from a first-person singular perspective to a first-person plural perspective without noticing the difference, right?
Interesting.
So yeah, so he says not every. So when you think about the first-person singular, you're thinking about the I, right? That's right. The perspective of in a novel where the person's saying things like "I did this" or "I did that." That's the first-person singular. That's a fine perspective, and that's a perspective that we're often working with, right? And when we make our plans about that from that perspective, so let's say like you're trying to purchase something, right? Or you're trying to get some money together to invest in something or something of that nature, right? Or maybe you're just trying to lose weight or something, right? You start thinking, okay, well, I want to do this. There might be some complexity in your personality about how badly you want to do it, right? But relatively, you're speaking, you're talking about yourself and things over which you have some control, right? And you can sort of plan to overcome the obstacles that are in the way. You can identify those obstacles, control your actions in order to achieve your goals, right? Now, even just at the level of the individual, it's way more complicated than that, right?
Yeah.
Let's say you may want to lose weight, but you may also not want to abstain from the second piece of pecan pie. And that's a problem, right? So just even at the individual level, right, achieving our goals is not as easy as it might sound on the on the surface, right? Yeah. But then we can kind of shift over from that to the we perspective, right? And that's always really, that's a little more complicated than people think. Like, I know this is going to sound flippant at first, but who, right? Like what we am I being included in, and who am I including in the we when I state it, right?
Yeah.
Do you follow me? So, can we say we Americans? I mean, in some ways, I think we can, like from a maybe technical legal perspective, right?
Sure.
But if I say we Americans believe in God, we hold. If I say
who's we, white man? Yeah.
If I say like we hold these truths to be self-evident, really? Like who's the we there, right? And immediately it becomes much more complicated. Notice the word complicated arises here when you start thinking about, well, what goals are we going to achieve, right?
Yeah.
And then, because for one thing is, well, what goals do we have together, right? Right? So,
yeah, and this should be totally easy for anybody who's watched the news for more than 10 minutes today. Like, understand, like when you have, both of our political parties saying, we both, like they're both saying we stand for the values of Americans. Well, what do you mean?
Like which Americans? Who?
Yeah. Y'all are saying opposite things, but you're both stating that that royal we, it's everybody. We talk for the Americans, and well, yeah,
and there might be kind of you and I have discussed this some in the past. There might be kind of and this is a further topic. But there might be a level at which we could talk about kind of tribal identities from a sociological perspective.
Oh yeah,
in which we could use the word "we," but those are slices, right? Especially in our kind of complicated modern societies, right? Those are slices of the broader community, right?
Yeah.
So it's important. He's not saying that the "we" perspective is illegitimate. He just thinks that we need to be very careful and aware of the fact when we switch from the I to the we, or when we switch from the kind of small subset kind of tribal loyalties we might have, right? where we can really speak of a we, right, to the broader society, right?
Yeah.
A good example of this is, how do you react to the recent right to bear arms rally in Virginia, right? You know, people are going to react to that very differently. Some people look at that and see all those people with firearms, and it just totally freaks them out. And they're like, "This is the word. These are fanatical weirdos. Like, how could they be like that?" To other people, you know, like myself, I see law-abiding people exercising their rights. There were no acts of violence done that day. You know, it was actually a completely peaceful rally. It was racially diverse. I mean, it was actually completely, fine from my perspective. But I'm speaking from a certain we that's not a kind of we that includes New York City, San Francisco, or places like that.
I'm Texan, and I mean, and from a Texan perspective, we just call that Monday. My wife's Canadian. My wife's Canadian, so I mean, while we have similar political views, it's still like not a normal thing to see that. So it's So I mean, it is one of the it is one of those things where when you talk about the we, you do need to at least acknowledge that it is very limited, and so definitely we need to be careful in how we use it, and I think it's smart not to throw it around.
Yeah, and from a political, social perspective, right? He wants to say, look, the we is just not homogeneous. And part of effective political thinking involves the recognition that I've gone from a homogeneous I, right, to a heterogeneous we, right? In which there's a lot of difference wrapped in there. And then probably the most important controlling idea. So the first one was, just flawed human being, any imperfections of human beings. The second one idea has to do with the difference between the I perspective and the we perspective. And the third idea is really kind of the core, which is pessimism versus the unscrupulous optimist, right? Yeah. Or the naive optimist. So the pessimist, the way he puts it is, the pessimist recognizes the complexity of social and political life, and recognizes the limitations on human satisfaction. So the way he's defining pessimist, right, is that there is an irreducible and insurmountable complexity to political and social life, and that there are limitations to human satisfaction that we must recognize in order to be mature, and that we should recognize and value in order to be good. So I think is a good observation.
Yeah. Now, just for is this could you call his kind of uses of pessimism kind of trying to be more of a realist?
Sure, I think that's fair. I mean, he said in several interviews subsequent to the book's publication before his death that I mean, you could just say it's being a really rigorous realist, but it means here's the thing, it does mean embracing suffering to a certain degree. Yeah. Right? And I think that's why he likes the term pessimism. And that even sort of seeing that some suffering is actually part of our human good, which sounds weird, right? But the suffering you might experience in accepting a limitation, say accepting a limitation financially, sexually, socially, actually might often contribute to your good, right? The goodness of your life, right? The flourishing. He has a really interesting idea, and I don't want to get too far on this, but he actually thinks that and he gets this from Schopenhauer, that a lot of what makes life dear and precious is our recognition of its limitations and mortality in particular. And that, interesting, he thinks we wouldn't be as happy if we didn't sort of frame our lives against mortality. Now, he's not trying to make any statements about an afterlife. He's very clear about that. But just recognizing that that our lives have a horizon, a temporal horizon, and that it's going to come to an end actually makes us happier, which is interesting. Right? What do you think about
it's
it?
not my first reaction, but but I think also like he's talking about a maturity that I think is, there that I would say maybe many adults in our society lack. That there's a real maturity to have this pessimism without leading it to despair.
Yes.
And that's why I think why. Yeah. Go
I
ahead.
don't think that pessimism in his case means despair. In fact, he thinks it means living well and thinking accurately.
Yeah, and I think that's completely countercultural to, a lot of the, self-help and things like that are, you stand in the mirror every morning and you talk about what you're going to manifest that day or something. I mean, it's just, I get it. You have to, there's a lot of things, sports, a lot of things visualize before you actually accomplish. And some of that stuff is helpful. But this idea that we shouldn't, we should kind of destroy anything that's negative in our world or worldview. No, when you were talking about suffering, I remember somebody was I forget exactly how the saying goes, but it was talking about the suffering even of when you look at just countries. What has that country produced? And it was talking about Italy and the suffering that Italy, but they're like, look at what Italy's produced, Michelangelo, and it goes through all these beautiful works of art, these artists and all these things, and then they're like, now look at this, look at what was it? Look at Switzerland. They gave us the cuckoo clock. Like the country is just, there's even the phrase, I'm Switzerland, I'm neutral, I'm not going to take any sides. I'm going to be this kind of peaceful flowing river throughout I'm not, what have they given us? Yeah, the cuckoo clock.
Well, to just take a pot shot. So just they also gave us Hans von Balthasar, but whatever. You can take that however you want. So again, the pessimist, right, accepts that suffering is part of life, accepts that there are limitations, right, to satisfaction, recognizes those, and even thinks that those limitations are good, and that therefore some suffering, insofar as you think of limiting satisfaction as a kind of suffering, unfulfilled desire, right, is actually necessary and actually good. The optimist, on the other hand, thinks that dissatisfaction is always bad, thinks that pain is always bad, and thinks that there are no limits. This is so important. There are no limits to satisfaction, and moreover, that if there are any, there shouldn't be any. Right.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So there's an ethical kind of twist here, right? That this limitation on satisfaction is bad because it causes pain, and pain is bad, right? Put it that way, it sounds kind of infantile, but to be truthful, like a lot of our politics is run by a kind of infantile enthusiasm. I am so tired of hearing people complain about their student loans. Right? I get it, right? You borrowed a lot of money. Did you not know that you had to pay it back? That's called a loan. That's what it is.
If you're going to college, you should be able to understand the definition of loan.
That's right. I mean, just stop it. Stop whining about your student loan, right? Get a job. Drive for Lyft, do something, right? Like work in a factory, pay it off, get over it, right?
Yeah, or be mad at the people that told you to take out $80,000 to get a degree in a job that'll make you $40.
That's right. I mean, I do get it. Maybe I get a job of coaching people up on these matters. And it's probably the case that as a society we need to encourage less people to go to overpriced colleges, but at the same time, like at some point you just have to say, I get it that it's painful, but that's just the nature of taking out a loan, right? Just as an example, the pain that we experience in lost opportunities, and being beaten out in something. I mean, that's just part of life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, do you want to get rid of games because somebody has to lose? Well, I hope not.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's going to be pain on one side, right? Um, when you're competing, we don't talk about it this way, but when you're competing for a spouse, right? You know, somebody's going to win. Like as long as we've got some monogamy kicking around, thank God, right? Somebody's going to win, right? And do we get rid of monogamy in marriage because some people lose?
Yeah.
Uh,
No.
I hope not. Right? So, anyways, there are just limitations, right? In terms of what we can reach in terms of satisfaction. An obvious example of this is that you can't have everything, right? As much as
Yeah.
we want to say you cannot, right? Whenever you actualize your freedom in choosing one good, right, you close yourself off from other goods, and that's just the nature of life. And if you sit around and think, I married Claire, but that means I can't have sex with Susie. Well, I mean, yes, you're right. You can't have sex with Susie now that you married Claire. Appreciate Claire, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I mean, and I always go back to because so many of these topics, like if you think about parenting, if I were to parent my children this way, like if I were to parent my children with this kind of just naive optimism, like, yeah, my kids would be spoiled, miserable little human beings. But no, like you understand, but you also, because you have the perspective of a parent, you understand the things of a child, or hopefully you should, fairly well, to where you could say, no, trust me, this little suffering is going to bring about a better good.
That's right.
And you have that perspective. You could see that, so. But as soon as we kind of turn that focus in on ourselves, or talk about the world or something, we immediately throw out the rationality that we have as parents towards our children,
Sure,
which
sure.
I think sometimes it's so frustrating to watch. It's like, no, like.
Yeah, absolutely. So, those are three. I mean, to follow up your point, I think so often, again, our politics revolves around kind of with childishness,
Yeah.
infantile desires that really don't have place in politics or mature self-governance, right?
Right.
So those are the three main ideas, right? Again, right, imperfection, complexity of human beings. Second, that we need to pay attention to the first person perspective versus the second, the we, right? The plural perspective. And then third, just the real difference between pessimism and optimism, which revolves around the idea of limitations to satisfaction. So those are the three main ideas he wants to bring in here. Any thoughts or questions about those, Jason? Or
Nope, fairly clear. That's where we're going to begin. So where does he go from here after he establishes these?
He applies it to several different examples, and I'll just try to highlight some of the main ones here. Each of the book after he lays out these ideas at the beginning, he then goes in and each chapter, not every chapter, but most of the chapters concern different kinds of what he calls fallacies, right? And so these are ways of thinking, political ways of thinking that run afoul of these three principles, right? That laid out. So he lays out his three principles, and then he shows you cases where we reject these principles or ignore them, and some of the downside of doing so. So one of them is what he calls. So I'm just going to kind of go through these, and we'll just cover as many as we have time for. One of these is what he calls the best case fallacy. And so this is for the person who only thinks about what's the best case scenario here, like what's the best outcome, and doesn't regard the downside at all. So this is like if he points out, I think accurately, this is sort of the gambler's fallacy, or part of the gambler's fallacy, psychologically speaking, right? You're only thinking about, man, it's 100 to 1 odds So if I put down $100 or $1,000, what if I put down $10,000?
Yeah.
101. This is great. I'm gonna make a ton of money, right? This is awesome. Except that there's a good reason the bookie's offering you 101 odds, right?
Exactly.
And it's extremely unlikely, right? So, so this is problematic, right? Because it it ignores the reality of the downside. It ignores the reality of the obstacles. So one place you can see this played out, right, is in the loan policies, the financial policies that were developed really from the 70s and 80s, with the hopes that using Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, is that what they're called? In the hopes that home ownership would transform large segments of, we could say, disadvantaged elements of society. And home ownership can do that, right? Usually, though, for those who cut spending and create savings, right, for themselves and use those savings, right, to purchase, as a down payment to purchase a home. You follow me?
Yeah.
But it's just too hard, it's too complicated for lots of people who are disadvantaged. And so what we need to do is we need to create loan programs that will make it easier for them to acquire credit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And get rid of the usual standards and criteria that are required for getting a loan, right? So that, when my parents were purchasing a home, it was still the case that it was expected that you had 20% down. Right?
Yeah.
If you didn't have a 20% down payment, that's it, right? Well, over time, those things have been eroded, right? Yeah. Oftentimes out of an egalitarian ethos, right? The idea that what we need to do is lower these loan standards, and we'll get the government to come in and sponsor that part of the risk that the banks are taking on, in order to kind of get this social goal, right? So you're
Sounds
only
great. Sounds great.
Let's do it. Let's do it. 0% down. Let's go.
Full proof.
Well, we all know how that turned out, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was obviously the financial collapse was a big problem, and it was complicated, and there are other factors than what I'm talking about, but that was certainly a factor, right? And so just thinking about the best case scenario, like, we're going to transform these segments of society by creating these easy to get loans, right? Sure. Ignore the downside of there's a reason that we've developed the criteria we did for taking out a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
Because we found that these are the most trustworthy borrowers who meet this criteria. Not most trustworthy necessarily because they're more moral, that might be the case, but because they have the wherewithal, they have the resources to pay back a loan, right? And we found this over time. So loan standards actually, this sounds mean, right? But they should be high. It shouldn't be easy to get large amounts of credit, right?
Yeah.
It should actually be hard. It'd be better for us, right? How many people wish they didn't have a credit card?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, the ones with all the debt. They're the ones that...
Yeah, I mean, you get it, and you're just sort of like, a lot of people get it, and they overuse it, and they look back on it, and they're like, dang it, that's $10,000 in just consumer debt, high interest, whatever, and then you're digging your way out of that hole for the next 5 years, right, or 6 or 7 years, right? You know what? It would be better, even though credit cards sound great, right? It would be just better, right? If credit card, not everybody was offered a credit card, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's just another sort of example. So that's the best case fallacy. Another fallacy is what he calls the born free fallacy, which I really like. This goes back to really Rousseau. And so Rousseau had the idea, right, that, just put it in just a phrase, that man is born free, yet we find him everywhere in shackles, right? So the idea here is that really this is kind of getting at what you were talking about with respect to Dr. Kelly's class, that really man is naturally free and self-governing and good. But society, right, creates inequalities that make man not free, that make him enslaved, right? And so that it's really society that's the problem, right? The mere conventions of society repress human beings. In a lot of ways, Rousseau, Rousseau and Voltaire can be associated with, right, as the kind of intellectual forebears of the French Revolution. There's a lot to be said against this perspective. And what Scruton wants to point out is, well, actually, self-governance is not a given. Self-governance is an achievement. And I think that's really worth thinking about, right?
Yeah.
Self-governance. If you think about freedom as self-governance, right?
Okay.
Right. I mean, governing yourself, right? Controlling yourself, moving in a logical and rational way from means to a goal, right? To a selected, intended end. Selecting means, selecting resources to achieve that end. That's genuine self-governance, right?
Mm-hmm.
He thinks that actually self-governance is not something that we have. We have the capacity for it, I guess you would say, but not the reality of it when we're born, right? And that to really actualize it, we actually need society. That actually, that learning self-governance requires traditions, it requires family, it requires customs. It requires that those societies and customs create limitations, right, that actually help us, right, to achieve self-governance.
Right. Well, which is what my question would be, is where, if we're born free and we're aimed at this self-governance, how do we develop the limits of our governance to ourselves, if not from the traditions, the customs, like you said, from the way our parents raised us and all these things? Like, there has to be something there than this kind of just blank slate kind of discover for yourself the limits of your own self-governance. There has to be something else. Yeah.
So, I mean, one way to think about it is just think about your aspirations, right? What goals are laudable or praiseworthy, right? Well, to a large degree, and what means are acceptable, right? So what goals are praiseworthy and what means are acceptable? We learn those to a large degree from custom, from our society, from our tradition. And, it is the case that when we accept certain goals, we're excluding others. When we accept certain means and say this group of means is not acceptable, we're introducing limitations. But that those limitations actually help us, right? So, I mean, an obvious example of this would be traffic laws, right? If you don't have traffic laws, you say, oh, it's so unfair, I have to drive on the right side of the road. Like, okay, I mean, I really want to drive on the left side. This is so, I think it's not that cool. And I think, in response, you would say, well, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with driving on the left side, right? You could organize it that way. We've got to organize it some way. And once we organize it in some way, it's going to limit and exclude the alternative form of organization. Does that make sense?
There has to, when you establish a standard, it excludes things that are not the standard.
Right.
That's how standards work.
That's right.
Like a foot is 12 inches, which excludes 11, 10, 9, 13, 14, 15. We have to have a standard. I mean, if you're a construction worker, you understand standards and the limits to those standards. Like,
that's right. Absolutely. Like, this is actually not going to be a load-bearing wall, right? Like, it's not capable of being a load-bearing wall because you want to build it out of paper. It's like, it's not fair, like, shut up. It's not about fair, right? So anyways, so the limitations that our society brings out are actually useful and help us to achieve self-governance. So it's the opposite of what we tend to think romantically. We tend to think romantically, well, if we can just get rid of these social conventions, then in fact we could govern ourselves effectively. This is, of course, most obvious, right, in the sexual license of contemporary society, right?
Sure.
So since the sexual revolution in the 1960s, even if you're not thinking about it in heavily moralistic terms, even if you're not thinking about it theologically, I think you have to say, right, that the kind of sexual license encouraged in the 1960s has been highly destructive, and usually highly destructive, especially among those who have the least resources to deal with the blowback of sexual license. Something that's really interesting that's emerged from the sociological data, from the data of sociology on these issues, is that marriage has, despite what you might think rhetorically, right,
Sure.
from the way people talk, marriage has declined most amongst the poor. It's declined the least among the well-to-do. Now, there's some chicken and egg kind of questions here of causality, right?
Yeah.
But something you can pretty clearly say is that you're better off having children in a monogamous relationship, a committed monogamous relationship, just from a practical point of view, right? You have that partner that can provide you with support, right? You create a network of families that can provide you with support, right? If you've ever been in a situation where you have to ask, an in-law or a parent for some help financially, you know how valuable that assistance is, right?
Oh yeah.
And so really we developed, admittedly, from a contemporary point of view, restrictive sexual mores. But those restrictive sexual mores actually kind of helped in ways that I think people didn't realize in the 1960s. They only saw, oh, this is limiting me. This is keeping me from being free. When actually governing yourself and developing, and I'm trying to avoid moralistic terms here because I just want to bring out this particular point.
Yeah,
developing a healthy sexual life, developing an effective, just practical life, really probably does mean controlling yourself, right? And limiting yourself and accepting some limitations from your society about that. I mean, how many people's lives have been wrecked, right?
Yeah.
Even if they've subsequently recovered, how many people's lives have been wrecked by excessive, licentious sexual behavior outside of just the morality of it, just in terms of the economics of it, social reality of it.
Oh yeah.
Physical or psychological harm, right? That accrues, right? So all of those things. Does that make sense, Jason?
Yeah, I remember even during the housing crisis, I remember reading an article about it kind of had a fantastic title, but it was tied in with the economics, and it said, we have I don't know, I forget the year, 10-year low in the number of divorces happening. But if you read the article, it was all because it costs too much to get divorced.
Right.
So when you combine the cost of divorce with the housing crisis and kind of the financial insecurity, people were staying together simply because of the finances. So I mean, it was just one of those things where when you look at, not like you said, not even looking at the moral, spiritual, religious aspects of it in that way, when you look at just kind of the sheer finances and secular kind of issues with it, that license has real and bad effects.
That's right.
That you can't ignore. You can't ignore them. And even when you look at the sexual license with regards to disease, I don't know how many diseases did not exist, 100 years ago that now exist because of, as part of this sexual license as an effect of it. So I mean, it's this this unintended. Nobody intends these, but again, this is the use of pessimism.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. It's not the case that this restrictions of society are only restrictive, right?
Right.
That actually the limitations we inherit from society often maybe not always, but often provide us with the very means for genuine self-governance, right? For
Sure.
genuinely achieving our goals, right? I mean, if you have a bunch of out of wedlock kids and you have no connection with usually the man, that just puts you in a bad spot. And yeah, maybe a couple of celebrities, a couple of, multimillionaire celebrities can make that all work, right, in this magical way. But for the vast majority of people, that's a disastrous situation, right? And then you say, oh, well, the solution is more abortion. Well, probably not, right? That actually has psychological effects too. Maybe the solution is don't be licentious, right? Maybe that's maybe that's something you could do, right? Let me give you one other example of this in terms of self-governance. Most people still, even in a society as wacky as ours, still want to find, at the very least, I would say, a monogamous long-term relationship, right? Again, kind of try to avoid the theological perspective or language. Lots of them would still say they want to get married, maybe less than in the past. But they either want marriage or something approximating marriage. Even if they don't call it marriage, even if they don't take vows, they want something that approximates traditional marriage, right? And so you think, okay, that's the goal of a lot of people. Maybe they don't, maybe they want to be very casual about how it occurs, right? Or something like that. But then also there's sometimes points in life where people are like, gosh, I really want this to happen. Let's make this happen, right? Well, one of the problems in our contemporary society is it's really hard for people to connect in that way. And one of the reasons it's difficult, there are a variety of reasons, but that we don't have any customs anymore about courtship. The dating world, right, is just kind of wide open. And it's not like there aren't a set of expectations, right, that are inherited anymore, So like when I first started dating, like it was, you go and ask a girl out on a date, right? And you go and pick her up in a car, which presupposes you have a car, right? And that you're trustworthy enough, right, to pick somebody up and be in a car with them, right, etc. You see how that goes, right? And you take the girl to a restaurant, right, or something like that, and you spend money, and all that is meant to is to show, right, affection or interest. That's what I should say, interest, right? Those kinds of customs and expectations are just, some people still have them, but a lot of people don't. And that's just a minor issue there, but it means that we don't have a language or a set of customs that helps us to navigate that area effectively.
Yeah, or even the fact that kind of relationship or interest is aimed towards marriage. Like you can't even assume that anymore.
Right.
It's just it's and even I don't know if he addresses this in his book, but I mean that which I mean it sounds very closely related to this kind of born free idea, but I mean just the extreme individualism that is just is all over our society with regards to, again, what I want. And not just what I want according to how I was raised, but I define the things that I want. And I think like you were pointing out there, I think that's one of the most destructive things that I don't mean to sound like an old man here, but that young people do. I'm not that, despite my hairline, I'm not that old. That young people do is they and again, this is maybe a characteristic of youth. I was once young, I understand this, but to simply set aside traditions as just some sort of artifact, of saying, well, maybe there, not just maybe there's a better way, but this group was wrong, or these traditions have no value.
Right.
And so even when you look at some of the young people that are coming up, you do have those that are setting aside, but also it's interesting that you do have a set of young people today that are embracing those traditions and saying, "Whoa, this is these traditions are a foundation of culture." And if we begin to lose these, especially in Western culture, I mean, there's a real movement to preserve Western culture. And a very healthy, intellectually honest and all of that, sort of way. That, we this born free kind of thing is just
Right.
just flies in the face. Yeah.
Do we have time to do one more, Jason?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we'll just do this last one, which is the chapter. This isn't the last chapter of the book. There's many more. So this hopefully this conversation just whets your appetite for buying the book and reading it. But there's another chapter is on the Utopian Fallacy.
Yeah.
And for those of us who love political philosophy like I do, this was actually just kind of a treat. It was so much fun to read. In fact, I might go back and reread that chapter tonight. But here, like, let's say by utopian fallacy, he means thinking that you can conceive a society in thought that is perfect and that can be realized. That's perfect, and it's perfect because it's simplistic, right? And that society can be realized in complex reality, right? So the error, the underlying error is simplicity versus complexity, right? Yeah. So it's not just that we should think about political things for sure, right? And we should think about them carefully, and we should even think about like what's just, what's unjust, how should society be, or things of that nature. That's fine, but we also have to realize that those things that reality is not simplistic. Human beings are not simplistic. Societies are not simplistic. In fact, they're very complicated. And so the effort to try to impose a simplicity and an ideal on concrete reality without a recognition of the imperfection that will be there, that's the problem. And it can even lead towards real totalitarianism, to be frank, right?
Oh, yeah.
Which is interesting, because here's the thing: is you end up saying, well, like, give an example here of kind of Marxism or the French Revolution. What we need is equality. Everyone needs to be equal. Everyone needs to be absolutely equal. Well, the truth is, people aren't equal, right? That's a harsh thing to say, but the truth is, some people are smarter than others. Some people work harder than others. Some people are more attractive than others. And you know what? If you're more attractive, that's an advantage, right? Some people are more charismatic than others. These are natural inequalities that are part of the human condition. Some, regions are more advantageous than others, right? And if you happen to be born in a disadvantaged region, there's going to be inequality there. Oh, it's not fair, right? Everything should be equal, right? And so what you try to do is you try to level, right, society in such a way that you create a truly, absolutely equal playing field, right?
Yeah.
Where, even in America, like people say, oh, what we need is really equal opportunity. Well, I think what we need is a removal of artificial inequalities, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Different than saying everybody should have equal opportunity, because the truth is, if you're good looking, you've got a better opportunity than the ugly person, right? I mean,
if you have hair,
right. That's right. If you're, maybe you're just kind of, maybe you're, not super intelligent, you're disadvantaged compared to the person who is very intelligent. So it's just equality in that sense, as in sameness. I'm not talking about equality before the law, right? That sort of thing. But in terms of the sameness of opportunity or sameness of outcome, is simplistic. It's ultimately childish, and the attempt to impose it upon society actually leads to the gulag, right?
Yeah.
Because inequalities will keep reasserting themselves, right?
Right. Well, and when you think about kind of just the history of these utopian ideas played out in politics, when people who took power and tried to really I'm going to be faithful to Marx, and his philosophy. Well, to bring about this equal society, they had to instate huge amounts of terror and suffering and killing and like to bring about this utopian society where we're all free and happy. So in order to bring about this happiness, we have to literally terrorize millions of people. Like again, you know, I mean, that's where it logically goes. But I mean, to simply ignore the like you said, ignore the concrete applications when you're thinking about this theoretical sort of government or state or something like that is absolutely it's devastating, you know. And the 20th century is proof of that, obviously.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you think, look, if you have the delusion, right, that you know that like this sort of simplistic delusion of absolute equality, right, then you know what you're going to end up with is you're going to say, well, look, you know, we haven't produced it yet, right? Despite all of our noble efforts, what we need is a new 5-year plan, and in that new 5-year plan, we're going to sort of figure out the counter-revolutionary sources that are undermining the goal here, right, and the mission, right? So see, the problem is I mean, this plays out right now, right? In our contemporary culture wars, right, and the culture kampf, right, that America and the West is engaged in, you know, everything's not equal yet. So the problem is it's not, maybe we should wake up and realize that maybe, say, men and women are different, right? Instead, what we need to do is triple down on it, right? We need to blast, right, men more, or we need to blast, you know, those counter-revolutionary forces in Russia or wherever it is more, in order, because that's the real, I believe in equality. And if there is any inequality going on, it's because there's some counter-revolutionary force out there, right, keeping equality from happening.
Yeah, or if you have this evolutionary view of history of it's always going to get better. Well, if I start this revolution, it will speed it up. You know, like, and we can take the HOV lane straight to utopia. You know, I mean, it's absolutely maddening. And also, you know, just for our listeners' sake, the word utopia literally means no place. You know, like not gonna happen. It's no place. All right, Dr. Smith, we've reached our time. I want to encourage our listeners check out Roger Scruton's book. And on the uses of pessimism and the danger of false hope. Check it out. And also in the meantime, check all of our content out and our courses out at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.